So we're going to talk about cycle breaking now and the role of the cycle breaker. And this is part of the presentation around cycle breaking and burnout and boundaries in motherhood. I just like to break it up a little bit so people can kind of watch sections at their own time. And I find personally that having smaller sections is a little bit easier to get through, whether it's on your morning walk or other times. So a cycle breaker is really someone who interrupts a repeating loop or cycle. It's allowing a system or situation to move forward instead of repeating the same pattern. So, in therapy work and self development work, a cycle breaker is often someone who's really the first one to kind of break a generational pattern. So, this might be things like healing generational trauma, addiction, poverty, toxic relationship patterns. They might learn how to conscious parent and regulate their own emotions so they're not like passing on harmful practices to their own children. They're working on healing their own childhood trauma and showing up differently. They may be working on creating a conscious partnership and modeling that for their children and not just falling into like resentment and putting up with something that's not feeling good. So it's really it can be any level of recurring behavior loops or roles. It's often just like this is the first or one of the first people down the generational line or in recent generations, like parents, grandparents, maybe even further back, that is doing things differently. So it's going to be different for the next generation. Um, and with that cycle breaking piece, there's multiple truths in that. We can honor the truth of that past generations did the best they could with what they had for the most part. I mean, there's some exceptions to that, so I will just preface that there of like sometimes there were people who were very harmful and there's no one size fits all for everyone. But we also have more information and tools and resources now. So it's not always about our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, they don't exist in a vacuum. Like they grew up in their own time period, in their own culture. Psychology and therapy is a relatively new scientific discipline. It's just over 100 years old. And even if we go back a few generations, I mean, there's been a lot of development in the field. It was very stigmatized before, and also it wasn't as normalized. There was a lot that evolved to become more helpful. Like trauma became a diagnosis, PTSD. Then we had ways to actually treat that didn't exist before. So they often did the best they could with what they had, and it would have been harder for them to actually, harder, even impossible, to find the right tools or get support to learn the things they didn't know, both for the stigma as well as like lack of access. So oftentimes when we go into like generational work or cycle breaking work, there's two parts. We can get really protective of our parents or feel like, oh, I don't want to bash them. Like I get that they did the best they could. And knowing that like there's still things that weren't perfect or that could have done harm. There's things we're healing still. So when we know better, we can do better. It's really not about disrespecting our family or ancestors. And in terms of motherhood and the boundary and the cycle breaker role is um we don't really talk enough about when we go to become a parent. There's so many resources around like preparing for birth and breastfeeding and like what to expect when you're expecting. And usually there isn't a lot of information of like, oh, when you become a parent, a lot of your own stuff, anything like unresolved from your own child is very likely to actually come up. Like you may be processing things in a very different way. Because it's one thing to have our own experience and our own like adult understanding of being able to look back at our own childhood and see what we'd want to do differently, like see what wasn't okay, be processing that. And we have a different access to it when we have our own like little baby and child that grows up at different developmental stages. So one of the things with like personal kind of trauma or if there's overwhelming experiences that we haven't really processed from our own past is the emotions from those times can come very clearly to the surface. And depending on the age we were when it happened, it's like that can get really triggered when our children reach that age and we don't always consciously realize what's going on. So cycle breakers, I love cycle breakers. I have so much love and respect for like how much work it takes to really be the first one changing a generational pattern. And when you're doing that and raising your own children, like children take so much energy and support. So it's just another to acknowledge there's another layer of emotional like so much emotional labor that goes into trying to be the best regulated version of yourself, trying to work on and heal your own stuff while you're also trying to survive in the world, pay the bills, put meals on the table, and parent. So it's a lot, and it needs to be, I think we need to give ourselves a lot of compassion and grace for that. And we can really easily get hard on ourselves and see like what we're not doing, but even just doing that is huge. So I hope we can take some of that in, give ourselves credit and a lot of self-compassion. And also the thing as a trauma therapist and also as a mother, it's like our role when people are aware of the generational trauma impact and are hyper aware of how their own childhood has harmed them, there can be a shadow edge side of just being very hard on ourselves or very afraid of being a contributor to trauma for our own children. And that's kind of the thing about, coming here, having an Earth school experience, like being in a human body and human nervous system, is that we will have situations that put our nervous system into overwhelm. So put us into fight, flight, freeze. And basically, like trauma is levels of fight, flight, freeze, and pockets of unprocessed emotional memory. It can also like tie into belief systems about ourselves or others, but it's not about being perfect. We're never going to be perfect and regulated all the time. Like we can screw up, we can make mistakes. We will probably be some our children will probably have things to process that have to do with us and areas where we messed up. But if we can be self-aware, if we can reflect, if we can apologize and take accountability, if we can let our kid know like, "Hey, that was me. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have reacted that way. Like you didn't deserve to get yelled at or I overreacted." We are teaching them healthy relationship skills. So I think it's not about never messing up and not putting that pressure on us. It's like how do we teach them to have actually healthy, emotionally mature, self-aware adult relationships where nobody is going to be perfect. Like if they partner, if they have their own children for their own expectations, like they're not going to be perfect all the time, but if we can normalize like psychology tools and getting help and help building psychological resiliency and emotional awareness, like we're really setting them up to be resilient and we don't want to be the main source of their trauma, but if we can do the best we can and also model repair, model healthy interactions and develop resiliency, like that's going to serve them a lot better. So, in terms of the burnout and boundaries in motherhood, a lot of times for women, we can so easily individualize and personalize a lot of the struggles we go through. There's, but they're really actually rooted in these historical patterns. They often come from our family of origin and our parent, like the level of capacity our parents brought in, the roles they brought in, and that traces back through generations. So we can't fully separate what we're experiencing from this, again, like patriarchal colonial legacy. And so a lot of times women can come to therapy just being like really exhausted, resentful, being like, I want to, how do I feel better? How do I stop yelling at my kids? How do I be more fun in my partnership or not be nagging? But when we zoom out, we start seeing like, oh, there's these roles that are playing out, and there's these expectations we've taken on, or there may be this really unbalanced load that's like not fair to one person in that system, often the mother, not always, but in terms of this presentation, like statistically, it's more likely to be the woman. So so I think when we can acknowledge it that way, it can help us to not be like shooting on ourselves and think it's like a personal problem. It's often something that shows up for so many women. That's part of why I really love like women's groups and workshops with women together because it's one thing to have validation in your own personal like therapeutic relationship, but there's so many stories and hearing that like what so many women are dealing with just really helps to validate and normalize it and have a different experience. And so if we kind of go back into just history of women's rights even alone, it's relatively recently that women have had the right to even be considered like a full human and have the same rights as men in many areas, like to own property, to be able to have inheritance, to be able to vote, to have a legal identity or citizenship, to be able to leave a bad relationship, like for one legally, just to, like just not have custody of their kids threatened in that way. I mean, back when women were more property, or like back in our grandparents' generation, it didn't take a lot for a man to just say, like, take my wife to the mental institution and she could be whisked away. Oftentimes societies and cultures too would blame like a single mother if her husband was had addictions or like left the family. It'd be seen as somehow like she was a deficient wife, or like she would be blamed and often isolated from the community or judged in the community, and her children judged in the community, even when it's not her fault at all. So around the economic, workplace rights, even body autonomy and consent, a lot of this is relatively recent, and in some areas of the world, it still doesn't exist, and in some areas, it's under threat or has there's been reversals, and those are things I didn't think I'd see in my lifetime in the U.S. or other areas. But when we look at kind of the societal and the structural issues, we're some of these things around people pleasing and taking care of others and prioritizing other people over ourselves, it's like it's actually wired into us from generations. And when we have that like unhealed stuff or ways of surviving, and then we're parenting from survival, like that gets passed down in how we interact with our own children, like what qualities are supported, which ones are not, and that it takes many generations or someone coming along and really actively cycle breaking and doing that work consciously to really change that dramatically. And so it's not about just looking at the trauma and kind of blaming our ancestors, but when we see it from this place of, our subconscious and unconscious is all about protecting us and keeping us safe. Like that ancestral energy and patterns where we're deeply embedded in like survival and being okay, keeping women and keeping girls safe in the political and cultural context that existed at the time. So it's really about honoring like the survivorance of that and survivorship. So oftentimes when we can notice these thoughts in ourselves of like, oh, it's I shouldn't do this, it's not right. Like we can recognize this as a survival pattern that served a purpose. We can start relating to it differently. We can be like, oh, that makes sense. Like it makes sense why it's here. It's this residue of this old time, but it's actually safe now. It might be uncomfortable, but it is okay for me to take some steps here to start like shaking up the status quo a bit. And so it's not just like what's endured, but it's what's cultivated and the gifts. And so a lot of this comes from Indigenous scholars using survivorance to describe Native perseverance, creativity, cultural continuity despite historical trauma. So just wanting to like honor some of those patterns versus when we get locked into with kind of like parts work, we might have one part of ourselves really upset with another part to be like, stop people pleasing. Why did you just say yes? What's wrong with you versus like no, these are like really actually they're really deeply rooted patterns. They didn't start with us, they go back generations, and they were survival. And so like another exercise I'll kind of have women go through is to really honor the survivorance of this and how wired this is, and why it's wired into us is that for everyone who's here, it's a motherhood piece. Like if you have a daughter, or even your own sons as well too, like if you had gave birth to a daughter in a time period where she's going to grow up in a society where there's no real rights or power for her. And usually in those times, women wouldn't have had access to education. There wouldn't be other resources. There wasn't internet. There wasn't ways to get a different perspective. So it's just like, this is just how it is. It's how it's always been. So to give her the best life and best chance at success, like you'd actually have to, it be caring and loving to prepare her for what her options are going to be. And if she has to be either with her father and like a man of the house or married to someone, it's like she has to have a husband. So she would need to be a good, like, what are people looking for in a good wife? And you're going to need to actively actually discourage qualities in her if she's too independent, if she's too loud, if she's too dominant. Like you're going to have to suppress that in her so that you are taking care of her, so that she's not in a world that actually doesn't have a space for her, that isn't going to be safe for her. And so there'd be real, like there were real and actual threats to women's well-being in their future. There still is today, but it's come a long way. And for many of us, like that's not the reality we're living in anymore. So when we can kind of relate to the roots of some of these, we can relate to it in a different way. Our subconscious and unconscious is all about protecting us and keeping us safe. That ancestral lineage is like we want generations to live on. It doesn't so much matter if they're happy or living their best life, but it's like, are they alive? And so we can honor that, but also really separate it of like that was then and it's not right now. Like the risks aren't the same. And emotionally, again, when there's old energy there, the emotional impact can feel, our nervous system can feel like it's a huge threat. It can have a much bigger amount of fear, guilt, like big emotions can come up, but that doesn't mean that those emotions mean it's true in the present day. It's just old emotion coming up to release. And there's ways we can work with that. So many common internalized beliefs for women and mothers are we often tie overfunctioning and depletion to how we give and receive love, our sense of identity, like safety. It could be our role in our family of origin, generational patterns, worthiness, love, belonging, how we feel connected to others. So there's many different ways it can show up, but again, a lot of times there is this like burnout and self-sacrifice and kind of like martyr mom, or mom has to do all these things. And we see it so reflected in society around like women's experiences of parenting versus men's experience of parenting. I hear it all the time where like if a man is like I'm taking care of the kids and you go for a week on a work trip or you go for a weekend with the girls, it's like people are like, "Oh my God, that's such a good dad." And like nobody's doing that for moms. They're not like, "Oh my God, you're such an amazing mom," or like, "You've got all the kids at the grocery store. That's so good." I've heard from men I've worked with that if they take their kids to the grocery store or a trip, like women will be like, "Do you need help?" Or oh, like and it's like, or like babysitting your own kids. I mean, it's coming a long way. It's not every relationship, but there's still many where like society as a whole can just see, like often does not give credit to women. It's like you're expected to do this. Like, of course you are. Or there can be a judgment of like, oh, did she not, like, she didn't bake a birthday cake or she didn't bring something here. But nobody's like, oh, the dad didn't do it. Like, nobody's judging dads the same way. So, I mean, maybe that's shifting, maybe there's some, but in general, not as often. You don't hear as many of those stories. Another area that women carry a lot of as well, and again, statistically, I'm not saying all men, I'm not saying all relationships, but statistically, this is still happening on a cultural level. Women often carry a disproportionate share of invisible load and emotional labor. So there are some statistics that show that when women partner and like cohabitate or marry a male partner, they often end up with about 10 hours extra of domestic labor a week, and the man often ends up with less. So women often carry this disproportionate role. We've had with the women's revolution, women were called into the workforce in World War II because the men were off at war. So it went from like you're supposed to be a housekeeper, you're supposed to stay at home, have the house ready for your husband, like take care of the children, put your ribbon in your hair and be ready and be pleasant when he comes home for dinner. And then women got called out because they needed like to keep functioning. Like needed women in factories, we need them making ammunition. Like they got called into the workforce. And then when the men came back, on a cultural level, they tried to put the women back in the home, but that's when women fought for the right to work, the right to vote. Like they were like, no, we're not going back. We have not had like a men's cultural revolution. So women have had this permission to be more nurturing, to be mothers, to be caring, to have a career, to do these things, but there's still this stigma for men around like caretaking, emotional vulnerability. Like women have a lot more fluidity in gender roles and can be in the more feminine and can also claim more masculine traits with less social pushback, whereas men have not had that same revolution yet. And like that's a whole other topic, but it's like that is overdue. I think it really needs to happen. I think when we're seeing these like incel and male loneliness epidemic, it's like men's lack of being able to have more freedom socially in terms of like and good healthy real male role models of how do you have like healthy connection and emotional vulnerability and know your own emotions. It's like that is really impairing a section of men. So anyway, well, I won't get into that, but really with women often still, even if they're working outside the home, often still shoulder a much larger proportion of the like either home tasks. When we go into pink and blue jobs, like pink jobs are often daily jobs, whereas blue jobs can be like change the tires, put the oil in, mow the lawn. You don't have to do those every day. Dishes pile up every day. Like meal prep is multiple times a day. Uh, if you have children, multiple children, multiple times a day, snacks, preparing. And so oftentimes, what we have here too is there's there's a cool system or a cool resource called the Fair Play system, and it was created by a woman who got like just documented everything. I think she's a lawyer by trade, and then she created this system. And she talks pretty candidly in like trainings I've seen her do about how it kind of got to a point in her own marriage where she was like, I don't know if I can stay in this or not if my husband doesn't get on board. Because she really Excel sheet tracked like this is everything I'm doing. Like this is what happened when we were a couple, and now that we have children, like now this is all the cards I'm holding. And so these are examples of cards from her website. It's like, I think it's something about like when it's a couple without children, there's about 40 cards in the deck of like household things to keep track of, pets, cleaning the house, groceries for the home. You add one child and you add 60 more cards. You got two children, you've got multiple sets of cards again. And she really talks about it from like an industrial organizational standard of like when you have any task, you have three parts. You have planning, organization, and execution. So many times in many like straight couples, you have men who are like, "Oh, I help," but they're actually only doing execution. They're not holding the planning and organizing. So it's like they might be like, "Oh, I do groceries," but who's actually monitoring like what's in the cupboard and making the list? Who's aware of like what kids are eating what and what do they not like anymore? What are the allergies like? What's on sale? Like who has to answer the phone when they get there and they're like, "What else? I forgot the list at home or they don't have this. What do I get instead?" So she talks about how like one area for couples is to go through and be like who is actually holding the entire card, like the planning, organizing, and execution. Like sports is not just take the kid to sports. It is like be up at three, track when registration opens, be up at or off work and at that 8 a.m. window when it's like you don't get in there and then they don't get into the activity they want. You're on the group text chain. You're checking like does their equipment fit? Like do they need new things? Like when do we got to buy new stuff and have it ready and like pack that bag ready to go. So it's like you got to take all of that if you take the card. And so that's why a lot of women are exhausted and may not know why because it's like these tiny things that pile up. And for many like couples where both are working, um, and you have the birthing parent is often the mother, you have this piece of, even in well-intentioned couples and with like really good men who'd want to do more, what I've seen happen a lot of the time is when you have maternity leave and you have one, like the woman at home, like she just gets so much more exposure of like how to comfort the kids and taking responsibility for all of these things that even a lot of really like fantastic well-meaning men often just have no idea the amount of things that are required because they just haven't had to do the role. Um, and they'll talk about over and under functioning too and how that can play in. And so one of the things that can be important is John Gottman's research, which him and his wife are one of the top like couples research based like therapist research team. They have fantastic communication resources for couples. They're all very evidence based. But he's really found that it's not about, there's not like some magic number that feels is good for all couples, but like what's really important is like what feels fair within each relationship itself. So if it really feels unfair, it's not working for, and he also kind of gives advice too, where he talks about for men, it's like, okay, if you want more kind of like sexy time with your wife, you want more of that attraction, he's like, you need to do the dishes. Like, you need to show her respect and share the load equally, because if she's exhausted, if you're not pulling your share, like that impacts other things as well. The other terms there around kin keeping and man keeping, those are kind of like recent kind of coined terms, but those talk about women often share a lot of the emotional load of planning things. So it might be now that it's like, okay, you got to get stuff for your mother-in-law and like his sister, and like you got to organize the events and like get the card, get the gifts, like get Christmas ready, makes plans, like be like, is he seeing his friends? And do I reach out and like make sure he's seeing his friends, and I take total control of our social life. Not in a like overbearing way, but in a, like women often end up with those things. And so those can be other areas where it's like, okay, are we just taking this on by default? And are there some conversations we need to have here? Um, And overall, there's some research there in the fair play area too of like that exhaustion gap has been widening since the pandemic, which makes sense. I won't go into all the stats right now. You can check out the link and see where that is, but it's really just really supporting in many different areas. Like women are reporting being significantly more exhausted, more burnt out, like not having the same time for themselves or being able to care for themselves compared to men on a statistical level. Again, not all. Um, I know I had a magazine or some news outlet like reach out to me in the pandemic and they wanted some tips for moms of how to homeschool and work from home and like keep up with it. And they did not use me because I was just like, no, this is like bull crap. I was like, this expectation is insane. Like this is not sustainable. If just because there's a pandemic going on, like you would never in your right mind, under any other circumstance, be like, oh yeah, it's such a good idea to have a full-time career, work full-time hours, have no childcare, and homeschool. Like that's an insane expectation. Like my advice was recognizing how insane the current circumstances were and being like, what do you need to do to survive? Like, who can you have in your bubble? Can you hire help? Like, what can drop off? What supports can come in place? Like, what can you outsource? And also being like, it's more about getting through this. It is not about being like superwoman in all of these areas. They did not use me, but that's okay because I wasn't gonna feed into that like ridiculous narrative. And I just saw so many like these quick little articles of like, here's how to do this. And it just like sends this message again of like, if you just figure out a hack, like you're doing it wrong if you don't figure it out. And no, I don't like it. Anyway, I won't go on. But we see a lot of those messages. So it's like, notice those when you see them and use your critical thinking to be like, okay, yeah, like that's that like old patriarchal message that we're putting on women. I didn't see a single article that's like, how to be a stay-at-home like man raising your children and doing this, like how to step up and do this as a man. Like they were all geared towards women. And maybe there were some, but I never saw any. I saw a lot for women though. Yeah. And so I really like this quote from Glennon Doyle in Untamed. Mothers have martyred themselves in their children's name since the beginning of time. We have lived as if she who disappeared the most loves the most. We have been conditioned to prove our love by slowly ceasing to exist. What a terrible burden for children to bear. To know that they're the reasons their mother stopped living. What a terrible burden for our daughters to bear. To know that if they choose to become mothers, this will be their fate too. Because if we show them that being a martyr is the highest form of love, that's what they will become. They will feel obligated to love as well as their mothers loved after all. They will believe they have permission to live only as fully as their mothers allowed themselves to live. If we keep passing down the legacy of martyrdom to our daughters, with whom does it end? Which woman ever gets to live? And when does the death sentence begin? At the wedding altar, the delivery room? Whose delivery room? Our children's or our own? When we call martyrdom love, we teach our children that when love begins, life ends. This is why Jung suggested there is no greater burden on a child than the unlived life of a parent. And so, in terms of that cycle breaker piece, I think there's a piece where we can use that love for our children and that desire for something better for them to to support them, but also in support of our own work. So it's like two birds feeding one scone, not stones. So we don't need to kill birds. But really, it's like if we really look at this for what it is, if we're conscious of these old patterns and how we're buying into those old patterns, we can start to question them and relate to them differently. We can really ask ourselves, like, do we want to like raise boys who expect this and like that's what they're going into? Or do we want them to be like an equal partner and being able to share the load and being able to get out of some of these rigid gender expectations for themselves that like hold them back? Do we want our daughters to be be disproportionately holding everything? Like, or do we want something different for them? Like, do we want them to be able to be a mother, but like be able to have rest, like be able to have other people sharing that load, not feel like it's all on them or they have to be burnt out to be doing it right. And so sometimes it's like when we're aware of that, we can harness that to say, like, because it can feel hard and it can feel guilty and it's internalized messages and we can get pushback from partners, from our children of like trying to get them to take on more. But when we hold this like this vision of like this is actually how this serves you, it's not just it's not just what I say. It's like what am I modeling for you and how is this actually going to help you in the long run even if it's uncomfortable right now? Like we can use that for our own change and change in the system. So, some other pieces around burnout prevention and recovery. I'm just going to stop here now and then I'm going to do a separate section on this one.